The year was 1873, and spring arrived late to the Nebraska Territory. Winter had been merciless, leaving the land scarred and barren. The grasshoppers had come the previous summer, a biblical plague that devoured crops and hope alike, leaving starvation in their wake. Even now, as green finally began to push through the soil, hunger was a constant companion to those who had survived the brutal months. Samuel Hayes stood before his wife's grave, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the vast prairie sky. The marker was simple, a wooden cross with her name carved by his own hand, Margaret Hayes' beloved wife. He placed a small bouquet of the first wildflowers of spring at its base, blue prairie violets gathered from the creek bed where they had once walked together. 3 years, 4 months, 17 days, Margaret. He whispered, his voice rough from disuse. The road still stretches long ahead. The wind carried his words away across the endless plains. Samuel remained motionless, his weathered face impassive except for the slight tightening around his eyes. At 45, he looked older. The war between the states and grief had etched deep lines into his features. His hair, once dark brown, now showed substantial gray at the temples, and his beard was neatly trimmed but streaked with silver. When he finally turned away, his movements were deliberate, measured, as though each step required conscious thought. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, waited patiently nearby, reins loosely draped over a fence post. Samuel mounted with the practiced ease of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, though a slight wince betrayed the old wound in his left leg, a mini ball at Gettysburg that had never been properly removed. The ride back to his homestead took less than 20 minutes, the land around him beginning to show signs of careful cultivation. Samuel's farm stood as an anomaly in this harsh country, prosperous where others struggled, orderly where chaos often reigned. The two-story farmhouse was substantial without being ostentatious, built from timber, hauled at great expense from the distant Missouri. A barn corral and several outbuildings formed a protective semicircle, all maintained with military precision. Inside the main house, Samuel removed his hat and coat, hanging them on pegs by the door. The interior was clean, but sparse, functional, rather than comfortable. He moved through the silent rooms like a ghost, touching nothing, leaving no impression. In the kitchen, he kindled a fire in the stove and put on water to boil, his movements automatic, a routine carved by solitude. As the water heated, he made his way to the small workshop off the main room. Inside, bathed in the golden light filtering through a single window, stood a half-finished cradle. The wood was cherry polished, smooth in some places, rough in others, waiting for the touch of his tools. Samuel ran his fingers along the curved headboard, feeling the grain beneath his calloused skin. Every night for 3 years, he had worked on this cradle, though the child it was meant for had died unborn with Margaret. A rational man would have abandoned such a futile project. Yet Samuel returned to it night after night, shaping the wood as though completing it might somehow heal the wound in his soul. He selected a fine-grained piece of sandpaper and began to work the rough spots, his movements gentle, almost tender. The whistle of the kettle eventually pulled him away. He prepared a simple cup of coffee, drank it standing by the window, then reached for his rifle. It was time for his daily patrol of the property boundaries, another routine, another way to mark the passing of empty hours. The Winchester 73 was well maintained, like everything else Samuel owned. He checked it methodically before slinging it across his back and returning to his horse. The gelding, sensing they would ride again, pricked up his ears. Samuel adjusted the saddle, mounted, and turned the horse toward the eastern fence line. From his vantage point on a small rise, Samuel could see most of his property. The spring sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the awakening prairie. His trained eye noted that the creek was running higher than yesterday, that a section of fence needed repair, where winter had heaved the posts, that the young corn in the southernmost field was just beginning to emerge in thin green lines. A movement in the distance caught his attention. Through the haze of late afternoon light, he made out several figures near the boundary where his land met the Cartwright place. Something about their arrangement struck him as wrong. Samuel nudged his horse forward, approaching cautiously. As he drew closer, the scene clarified. A woman was bound to a fence post, her arms stretched painfully behind her. 4 children huddled nearby, their thin frames and hollow eyes speaking of prolonged hunger. 2 men stood before them, one gesturing angrily at the woman, while the other kept a wary eye on the children. Samuel recognized the men as George and William Reed, cousins to Joseph Reed, who had died of fever the previous year. They had taken over management of Joseph's homestead, supposedly looking after his widow and children. The stories Samuel had heard in town painted a different picture, one of greed thinly veiled as family duty. Samuel slowed his approach, not wanting to provoke violence that might endanger the children. When he was within earshot, he could hear the woman's desperate pleas. "Please take my children instead of me. They haven't eaten in 3 days," she was saying, her voice hoarse with thirst and fear. "I'll sign the papers. I'll renounce everything. Just feed them." The older Reed brother, William, laughed coldly. "Always the sacrifice, aren't you, Eleanor? But we both know those brats are worth more to us alive. The land passes through them after all." "You've already taken everything else," Eleanor said, straining against her bonds. "The livestock, the seat, even Joseph's pocket watch. What more do you want?" "What's rightfully ours," George replied, his hand resting meaningfully on the knife at his belt. "Your signature on those transfer papers, for one, and perhaps your pretty Sarah might still make a suitable match for the Hollister boy. Old man Hollister has offered a generous arrangement in exchange." At this, the oldest boy, no more than 12, lurched forward. "You leave my sister alone." Though his voice cracked with adolescence and fear, he planted himself before his siblings, small fists clenched. George Reed backhanded the boy casually, sending him sprawling in the dust. "Mind your place, Timothy. Men are talking." Samuel had seen enough. He urged his horse forward, emerging fully from the shadows of the cottonwoods. The animal's hooves made little sound on the soft spring earth, but something, perhaps the sudden stillness of the birds, alerted the Reed brothers to his presence. "Evening," Samuel said quietly, his hand resting casually near his holstered revolver. The single word carried weight, dropping into the scene like a stone into still water. William Reed's hand twitched toward his own weapon before recognition dawned. "Hayes, this is private family business." "Right on." Samuel dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He was taller than both Reed brothers by several inches, his frame lean but powerful. "Seems like poor hospitality binding a lady to a post." Eleanor Reed raised her head at his voice, and Samuel got his first clear look at her face. Despite the dirt and exhaustion, she was handsome rather than pretty, strong features, intelligent eyes that held both fear and fierce determination. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins, falling in tangled waves around a face that had once known comfort, but now showed the harsh edges of deprivation. "She's a thief," George said, puffing out his chest. "Caught her stealing food from our stores." "Your stores?" Samuel's voice remained mild, but something in his eyes made George take a small step backward. "Last I heard, those stores came from Joseph Reed's land, which he left to his wife and children." "The property reverts to the Reed family name," William insisted. "The law." "I'm familiar with the law," Samuel interrupted, moving toward Eleanor, "and with the character of men who'd starve children to claim what isn't theirs." He drew a knife from his belt, a movement so smooth it seemed almost gentle. The blade caught the fading sunlight as he moved behind Eleanor to cut her bonds. As he leaned close, she whispered a single word that froze him in place. "Joseph." The name hung in the air between them. Samuel's hands stilled on the ropes, and he found himself looking into Eleanor's eyes at close range. Something shifted in their depths, recognition, shock. "You're Samuel Hayes," she breathed, "from the 83rd Pennsylvania, Joseph Sargent." The knife completed its task almost of its own accord, the ropes falling away. Eleanor stumbled forward, her legs numb from standing bound for hours. Samuel caught her arm to steady her, his face impassive, though his mind reeled. Joseph Reed, the young private who had dragged Samuel to safety at Gettysburg when a Confederate bullet found his leg. The boy who had died pulling other wounded men from a burning field hospital while Samuel lay unconscious. The man whose final words had been a request that Samuel find his family if he didn't make it home. "You have me at a disadvantage, ma'am," Samuel said quietly, though they both knew it was a formality. The connection hung between them, electric and unexpected. William Reed stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "Whatever acquaintance you might claim, Hayes, it doesn't change the fact that this woman is under our guardianship. The children, too." Samuel turned to face him, keeping Eleanor slightly behind his shoulder. "I see 4 hungry children and a woman who's been mistreated. I see 2 men who ought to know better." His voice remained even conversational, but his hand had shifted to rest on his holstered Colt. "You're interfering where you don't belong," George warned, though he made no move to approach. "Perhaps." Samuel nodded toward the children. "But I'm taking Mrs. Reed and her children with me nonetheless. They'll be my guests until this matter is settled properly." Eleanor's breath caught. "Mr. Hayes, I couldn't possibly—" It's no imposition, Samuel cut in his eyes, never leaving the Reed brothers. I have the room. William's face darkened. You'll regret this, Hayes. The town won't look kindly on a widower taking in a woman not his wife. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something cold entered his voice. Go now before I forget I'm a civilized man. His hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his revolver, and the Reed brothers, recognizing the look of a man who had seen and dealt death before, took a step back. This isn't over, George called as they retreated toward their horses. We'll be back with the sheriff. Samuel watched until they were mounted and riding away before turning his attention to Eleanor and the children. The oldest boy, Timothy, had picked himself up from the dirt and stood protectively near his siblings, eyeing Samuel warily. The second child, a girl of perhaps 9, held the hand of a younger boy, while the smallest, a girl no more than 4, peered at Samuel from behind her sister's skirts. Can you ride Mrs. Reed? Samuel asked. Eleanor nodded, though she swayed slightly. Yes, but the children, the little ones can ride with us. The older 2 can walk alongside. He moved to his horse and adjusted the stirrups. Let me help you up first. His hands were impersonal but gentle as he helped Eleanor into the saddle. Once she was settled, he lifted the youngest child, a tiny wisp of a girl with solemn eyes, and handed her up to her mother. Hold tight to your mama, he instructed softly. The child nodded, too weary or frightened to speak. Samuel lifted the younger boy next, settling him in front of Eleanor, then turned to the older children. It's not far to my place. Can you manage the walk? Timothy straightened his thin shoulders. Yes, sir. We can manage. Good lad. Samuel took the reins and began to lead the horse, setting a pace the children could maintain despite their exhaustion. As they walked, Eleanor looked down at the man leading them to safety. Mr. Hayes, she said quietly, Joseph told me about you in his letters. He said you were the finest man he'd ever known. Samuel kept his eyes on the path ahead. Your husband was a brave soldier, ma'am, a good man. He saved your life. He did. Samuel's voice was tight and lost his own saving others. Eleanor was silent for a moment. How did you find us after all this time? Samuel's stride didn't falter. I've been looking for Joseph's family since I returned from the war. I promised him I would see you were taken care of if he didn't make it home. He paused. I followed rumors of a Reed family that had moved west. Found your homestead last year, but by then Joseph was gone, Eleanor finished softly. Samuel nodded. I watched from a distance. Wasn't sure it was the right time to introduce myself. Then when I heard about his cousins taking over, he trailed off. You've been watching over us. There was something in her voice, surprise, perhaps gratitude, perhaps wariness. From a distance, Samuel confirmed. I never imagined I'd find you like this. They walked in silence for a time, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather and the soft footfalls of the children. The sun continued its descent, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. The small packages of food, Eleanor said suddenly, the mended fence last winter, the load of firewood that appeared after the blizzard, that was you. Samuel didn't answer directly. I made a promise to your husband, Mrs. Reed. I aim to keep it. Samuel's homestead appeared as they crested a gentle rise, the whitewashed buildings catching the last rays of sunset. The main house glowed golden against the darkening sky windows, like warm eyes watching their approach. He led them to the back entrance, helping Eleanor down from the horse before lifting each child to the ground. The youngest girl clung to her mother's skirts, thumb in mouth, while the others stared at the house with undisguised wonder. It's so big, the 9-year-old whispered. Samuel opened the door, gesturing them inside. Kitchen's through here. You all must be hungry. The kitchen was the heart of the house, warmer and more lived in than the other rooms. A large cast-iron stove dominated one wall, and a sturdy table with 8 chairs occupied the center of the space. Samuel moved efficiently, building up the fire in the stove and setting a large pot of stew to reheat. Eleanor hovered uncertainly by the door, keeping the children close. Mr. Hayes, I don't know how to thank you, but we can't impose. It's no imposition, Samuel said, cutting bread from a loaf in the pantry. And there's no need for thanks. I made a promise. A promise made years ago to a dying man doesn't obligate you to take in 5 strangers, Eleanor said quietly. Samuel paused in his preparations, looking at her directly for the first time since their arrival. Mrs. Reed, where would you go if not here? The question hung in the air unanswerable. Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly in defeat. "The children need washing up," she said instead of answering. "Is there pumps outside for now? I'll heat water for proper baths after supper." Samuel gestured to a side door. "Outhouses past the garden to the left." While Eleanor took the children to wash, Samuel laid the table with a precision that spoke of military habits never abandoned. By the time they returned clean-faced, though, still in worn clothing, bowls of steaming stew and thick slices of bread awaited them. The children hesitated, looking to their mother for permission. "Go on," Eleanor said softly. "Mind your manners and thank Mr. Hayes." They needed no further encouragement. Timothy and his siblings slid into chairs, murmuring shy thanks before falling upon the food with barely restrained desperation. Only the youngest girl, Emily, seemed too weary to eat, listlessly stirring her stew until Eleanor gently helped her with small spoonfuls. Samuel ate standing by the window, watching the family at his table. The silence was broken only by the sounds of eating and the occasional murmur from Eleanor to one of the children. He noted how she took very little for herself, instead ensuring each child had enough. When the meal was finished, the children's eyelids were drooping with the combined weight of food and exhaustion. "I've made up beds upstairs," Samuel said. "2 rooms, one for the boys, one for you and the girls." Eleanor looked startled. "You've prepared beds already?" A slight flush touched Samuel's weathered cheeks. "After I saw what was happening at the fence line, I rode ahead to get things ready while you were walking with the children." She studied him for a moment. "You're a very efficient man, Mr. Hayes." "Army habits," he replied simply. Samuel led them upstairs to the prepared rooms. Both were simple but clean, with fresh linens on the beds and pitchers of water on the washstands. Eleanor helped the younger children undress and wash more thoroughly using the provided soap and cloths. "These were my wife's," Samuel said awkwardly, setting a folded nightgown on the bed. "Might be big for you, but cleaner than what you have. I'll find more suitable clothes tomorrow." Eleanor touched the fabric gently. "Your wife, I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Hayes." Samuel nodded once, a sharp movement. 3 years ago, fever took her and our unborn child. The shared grief hung between them, a bridge of understanding neither had expected to find. "I'll leave you to settle in," Samuel said, turning to go. "If you need anything, I'll be downstairs." "Mr. Hayes," Eleanor called softly as he reached the door. When he turned, she stood straight despite her exhaustion. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for all the times you helped without making yourself known." Samuel's expression remained unreadable. "Get some rest, Mrs. Reed. Tomorrow will come soon enough." Downstairs, Samuel moved through his evening routine with mechanical precision. He checked the doors and windows, bang, the fire cleaned his rifle. But when he finally sat in his chair by the cold hearth, sleep eluded him. The house felt different with others under its roof. The silence that had been his constant companion for 3 years was broken by the occasional creak of floorboards above the soft murmur of Eleanor's voice as she comforted a child. Sounds of life. Sounds of family. Samuel rose restlessly and made his way to his workshop. The unfinished cradle sat in a pool of moonlight, the wood glowing silver. He ran his hand along the smooth curve of the headboard, then picked up a piece of sandpaper and began to work as he had done every night since Margaret died. But tonight, for the first time, he worked with a new awareness that upstairs children slept in beds that had stood empty for too long, and a woman whose husband had once saved his life now sheltered under his roof. "I found them, Joseph," he whispered to the ghost of a memory. "God help me know what to do next." Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a moment, panic seized her as she tried to remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day rushed back: the reeds, the ropes biting into her wrists, the unexpected arrival of Samuel Hayes. Beside her, Emily and Sarah still slept deeply, their small faces peaceful for the first time in months. Eleanor slipped quietly from the bed, pulled on her worn dress from yesterday, and moved to the window. Samuel's property stretched before her in the morning light. Fields of early wheat rippled in the breeze, and a kitchen garden flourished nearby, its neat rows promising future abundance. Beyond lay the vast expanse of prairie, dotted with spring wildflowers. It was beautiful in a stark, honest way, like the man who owned it. The smell of coffee and bacon drew her downstairs. In the kitchen, she found Samuel already dressed and cooking, his movements efficient but oddly graceful for such a large man. "Good morning, Mrs. Reed," he said without turning. "Coffee's hot, if you'd like some." "Thank you." Eleanor poured herself a cup, noting the fine quality of the china. You're up early. Farm doesn't run itself. Samuel transferred bacon to a platter. Already fed the livestock and checked the fences. Thought you and the children might be hungry when you woke. You didn't have to cook for us, Eleanor protested weakly. Samuel finally turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Been cooking for myself for 3 years, Mrs. Reed. Adding a few more plates isn't hardship. Before Eleanor could respond, the thunder of small feet on the stairs announced the arrival of the children. Michael, her 7-year-old, burst into the kitchen first, followed more sedately by Timothy and the girls. Mama, there's a barn with horses, Michael exclaimed, and chickens. Inside, voiced Michael. Eleanor reminded him automatically, though she couldn't help smiling at his enthusiasm. It had been too long since she'd seen genuine excitement in her children's eyes. Samuel set plates of food on the table. Eat up, he said. Growing children need their strength. The children needed no further encouragement, though Eleanor noted they remembered their manners this morning, waiting until everyone was served before beginning. Samuel again ate standing, watching the family with inscrutable eyes. When breakfast was finished, Eleanor rose to clear the dishes. Please let me help. It's the least I can do. Samuel hesitated, then nodded. I need to check the north pasture. Will you and the children be all right here for a few hours? Of course. Eleanor began stacking plates. We won't touch anything we shouldn't. Something like amusement flickered in Samuel's eyes. Mrs. Reed, you're welcome to touch whatever you need. This house has stood too empty for too long. After Samuel left, Eleanor set about washing the dishes, directing the children to help dry and put them away. The simple domesticity of the task felt foreign after months of struggle, yet somehow right. Mama, Sarah asked as she carefully dried a plate. How does Mr. Hayes know, Father? Eleanor hesitated, weighing how much to tell her perceptive daughter. They served together in the war. Your father saved Mr. Hayes's life. Timothy, who had been listening while sweeping the floor, straightened. Father was a hero. Yes, Eleanor said softly, one of many. Is that why Mr. Hayes is helping us? Sarah persisted. Because of Father, Eleanor considered the question. Partly. Mr. Hayes made a promise to your father to look after us if anything happened to him. But Father died last year, Timothy pointed out. Why didn't Mr. Hayes come then? He was watching over us from a distance, Eleanor explained. He didn't want to intrude on our grief. The children absorbed this information with solemn faces, the weight of their father's legacy settling on them in different ways. Timothy stood a little straighter while Sarah's eyes filled with quiet pride. After the kitchen was clean, Eleanor explored the house more thoroughly. It was larger than it had appeared last night, 4 bedrooms upstairs, a formal parlor, dining room, kitchen, and what must have been Samuel's office downstairs. Everything was meticulously maintained, yet oddly impersonal, as though the house were waiting for life to return to it. In the office, Eleanor found a small photograph in a silver frame, a pretty woman with kind eyes, her hand resting protectively over a slightly rounded belly, Margaret Hayes in her final months. Eleanor touched the frame gently, understanding the magnitude of Samuel's loss in a way only another widow could. She was returning the photograph to its place when she noticed a door she hadn't seen before partially hidden behind the desk. Curiosity drew her forward. She hesitated, knowing she shouldn't pry, then slowly turned the handle. The room beyond was small, a workshop filled with wood shavings and the clean smell of pine. Sunlight streamed through a single window, illuminating a half-finished cradle in the center of the space. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every joint and curve shaped with loving precision. Eleanor ran her fingers over the smooth headboard, feeling the care in each stroke of the sandpaper. It was meant for our child. Eleanor startled at Samuel's voice behind her. She turned to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I shouldn't have. It's all right. Samuel stepped into the room, his large frame seeming to fill the small space. I've been working on it every night since Margaret died. Can't seem to finish it, can't seem to stop either. Eleanor's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. It's beautiful work. Samuel ran his hand along the curved edge of the cradle. Sometimes building something helps me feel like I'm still building a future. The words seemed to surprise him as much as her, as though he hadn't meant to reveal so much. Their eyes met across the cradle, and in that moment Eleanor saw the depth of loneliness in this man who had saved her family. Not pity, she had seen enough of that in the past year to recognize it instantly, but understanding. the recognition of a soul who had walked the same dark path of loss. The moment stretched fragile and significant until Emily's voice broke the silence. "Mama, where are you, Kay?" Eleanor called back. "In here, sweetheart." And the spell was broken. She stepped away from the cradle as Emily appeared in the doorway, thumb in mouth. "There you are," the child said sleepily, holding out her arms to be picked up. Eleanor lifted her, settling the small weight on her hip. "Mr. Hayes and I were just talking." Samuel nodded to the child, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Hello, little one." Emily regarded him solemnly for a moment, then pulled her thumb from her mouth. "Your house is big," she declared. "Is it?" Samuel's voice gentled further. "Seems just right to me with you all in it." The simple statement hung in the air as he turned and left the room, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The Reed brothers returned as Samuel had known they would, bringing Sheriff Parker with them. Samuel saw them coming from the field where he was showing Timothy how to check for grasshopper eggs in the soil. "Go inside, son," he said quietly. "Tell your mother visitors are coming. Then keep the little ones in the back room until I call for you." Timothy looked toward the approaching riders, his young face hardening with recognition. "Yes, sir," he said, and ran toward the house. Samuel straightened, brushing dirt from his hands as the three riders approached. Sheriff Parker was a reasonable man from what Samuel knew of him, fair-minded, if somewhat prone to taking the path of least resistance. The Reed brothers flanked him like circling wolves, their faces set in triumphant sneers. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Samuel called as they dismounted. "Something I can help you with." Sheriff Parker removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. "Afternoon, Hayes. Got a complaint here about you harboring the Reed widow and her children against their legal guardian's wishes." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Mrs. Reed and her children are my guests, Sheriff. They came of their own free will after I found these men." He nodded toward the brothers, "had tied her to a fence post and were threatening her." "That true?" Parker asked, turning to the Reed brothers. William drew himself up indignantly. "She was being disciplined for stealing food, Sheriff. As her husband's family, we have every right to starve children." Samuel interrupted, his voice dangerously quiet. "To threaten to sell a 9-year-old girl to the Hollister boy in exchange for protection?" Parker's bushy eyebrows rose. "That part true, Reed." George shifted uncomfortably. "Hayes is twisting things. Old man Hollister has a boy of 14. It's a perfectly respectable arrangement for when the girl's older." "She's 9 years old," Samuel said flatly. "And from what I heard, the arrangement wasn't about marriage, but about protection with immediate effect." Parker's weathered face darkened. "That sounds mighty close to something I wouldn't tolerate in my county, Reed." The door to the house opened, and Eleanor stepped onto the porch. She had changed into one of Margaret's old dresses. Samuel noticed a simple blue cotton that hung slightly loose on her thinner frame, but was far better than the threadbare garment she'd arrived in. "Sheriff Parker," she called, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture, "I'd appreciate you hearing my side of this matter." Parker nodded, removing his hat. "Ma'am." Eleanor descended the steps with dignity, though Samuel noted how her hands trembled slightly at her sides. "My husband's cousins have systematically stolen everything of value from the property Joseph left to me and our children. The livestock, the seed corn, even personal possessions like his pocket watch. They've provided barely enough food to keep us alive while pressuring me to sign over the deed to the homestead." "Those are serious accusations," Parker said, his gaze sharpening. "They're true," Eleanor continued. "Yesterday, they caught me taking food from what used to be my own pantry to feed my children who haven't eaten properly in days. They tied me to a fence post as punishment and told me they had arranged to send my daughter Sarah to the Hollister farm in exchange for their protection." William Reed stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "She's lying. Sheriff, we've cared for her and those brats out of family duty, and this is how she repays us, by running off with the first man who offers her shelter. It's indecent. Indecent." Samuel's voice was soft but carried a dangerous edge. "What's indecent is 2 grown men starving children for profit." "The property belongs to the Reed family name," George insisted. "Joseph knew that when he brought her west." Eleanor's chin lifted. "The deed is in my name as well as Joseph's, with provisions for our children. Judge Wilson in Lincoln can confirm it. He drew up the papers himself." A flicker of uncertainty crossed William's face, quickly masked. "A technicality. The land was purchased with Reed family money." Was it, Samuel asked mildly, or was it purchased with Joseph's army pay and the money Eleanor brought to the marriage from her father's estate? All eyes turned to him in surprise. How would you know about that? William demanded. Samuel's gaze was steady. Because Joseph Reed was under my command in the 83rd Pennsylvania. He saved my life at Gettysburg, and I made him a promise, as he lay dying, that I would look after his family if he didn't make it home. He paused, letting the words sink in. I've been keeping that promise from a distance for a year, watching you steal from his widow and children, while I tried to find the right time to approach them. Sheriff Parker's expression changed as the pieces fell into place. You're that Hayes, the one they call the hero of Seminary Ridge. Samuel's jaw tightened. I'm no hero, Sheriff, just a man keeping his word. Joseph wrote about you, Eleanor said softly. In his letters, he said you were the finest man he'd ever known. A shadow crossed Samuel's face. Your husband was the hero, Mrs. Reed. I just survived. The atmosphere had shifted subtly. Sheriff Parker looked at the Reed brothers with new suspicion, while they shifted uncomfortably under the weight of Samuel's reputation. Well, Parker said, finally settling his hat back on his head, seems to me this is a matter for Judge Wilson to sort out. In the meantime, I see no reason why Mrs. Reed and her children can't remain as Mr. Hayes's guests, seeing as they came willingly, and there's clearly bad blood with you two. He nodded toward the Reed brothers. This is outrageous, William sputtered. She's a widow living unchaperoned with a single man. The community won't stand for such impropriety. The community, Samuel said quietly, seems more concerned with 4 children not starving than with gossip. He turned to Parker. Sheriff, I give you my word as a former officer that nothing improper will occur under my roof. Mrs. Reed and her children will be treated with the utmost respect as befits the family of the man who saved my life. Parker nodded slowly. That's good enough for me, Hayes. He turned to the Reed brothers. I suggest you two ride back to your place and prepare to answer some questions about the management of your cousin's estate. Judge Wilson will be mighty interested in what I have to tell him. William's face darkened with fury. This isn't over, Hayes. The town won't forget this scandal. Nor will they forget how you treated your brother's widow, Samuel replied evenly. Good day, gentlemen. He remained standing straight and tall until the 3 riders had departed the sheriff in one direction, the Reed brothers in another. Only when they were out of sight did he allow his shoulders to relax slightly. Eleanor stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself despite the spring warmth. They'll be back, she said quietly, with more than just the sheriff next time. Samuel turned to her, his face solemn. Yes, but we'll be ready. For the first time since he'd known her, Eleanor Reed smiled, a small, uncertain thing, but genuine. We, Samuel nodded once decisive. We. From the house came the sound of children's voices, Emily's high-pitched call for her mother rising above the others. Life where there had been only silence for 3 long years. Samuel Hayes felt something shift within him, some rigid piece of his carefully constructed solitude beginning to crack. Your children are calling you, Mrs. Reed, he said, gesturing toward the house. Eleanor's smile deepened slightly. So they are Mr. Hayes. She turned to go, then paused. Samuel. It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her questioningly. Thank you, she said simply, for keeping your promise to Joseph and to us. As she walked back to the house, Samuel Hayes stood in the yard of the home he had built, watching the first tentative green shoots of spring pushing through the soil around him. For the first time in 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days, he felt something that might, with care and time, grow into hope. I'll keep my word, Joseph, he murmured to the prairie wind. I'll protect them with my life, if need be. The promise settled around him like a mantle as he turned to follow Eleanor into the house, not just a house now, but perhaps someday a home once more. In the days that followed, life at the Hayes homestead found a new rhythm. Eleanor rose each morning before dawn, preparing breakfast for the household with quiet efficiency. Samuel would already be outside tending to the livestock, and early chores returning just as she set the table. The children gradually shed their wariness, venturing further from their mother's side to explore their temporary haven. Timothy at 12 shadowed Samuel whenever allowed, soaking up the man's silent knowledge of the land and animals. Samuel seemed unsure at first how to respond to the boy's earnest attention, but soon began assigning him small tasks, teaching him to check fence posts for rot, to identify the best feed for different animals, to read the weathers in the movement of clouds. You have a good eye, Samuel told him one evening as they repaired a section of chicken coop. That's important out here, seeing trouble before it arrives. Timothy straightened under the praise, his thin chest puffing out slightly. My pa was teaching me things before he got sick. But then, his voice faltered. Samuel's hands stilled on the wire he was stretching. Your father was a good man who taught me a thing or two as well. The boy looked up in surprise. He did? But you were his sergeant. Being in charge doesn't mean you know everything, Samuel said, handing Timothy the pliers. Your father knew medicine could stitch a wound cleaner than most army surgeons. Saved more than a few men that way. He paused, then added quietly, saved me. Timothy worked in silence for a moment, absorbing this new piece of his father's legacy. Do you think I could learn things like that, medicine and such? Samuel studied the boy, seeing Joseph Reed's determination in the set of his jaw. I think you can learn anything you set your mind to. Your mother knows herb lore might be a place to start. The mention of Eleanor brought a shadow to Timothy's face. The Reed cousins said women's medicine is just superstition. Said Ma was filling our heads with nonsense. Samuel's expression hardened momentarily. Those men wouldn't know wisdom if it knocked them from their horses. He placed a hand briefly on Timothy's shoulder, the first such gesture between them. Your mother kept you all alive through a hard winter with nothing but her knowledge and courage. That's worth more than gold out here. As April deepened into May, Samuel found himself increasingly aware of Eleanor's presence in his home. She moved through the rooms with a quiet grace, bringing order and warmth to spaces that had stood empty for too long. The smell of baking bread replaced the musty silence. Children's laughter echoed from corners where dust had gathered undisturbed for years. Eleanor had taken over the kitchen garden, expanding it with seedlings started on the windowsill. She worked with focused intensity, her hands sure in the soil, her knowledge of growing things evident in every decision. Samuel watched her sometimes from a distance, struck by the contrast between her gentle touch with plants and the steel in her spine when she spoke of her husband's cousins. One evening he found her kneeling among the newly planted rows, the setting sun casting her face in gold. She had tied back her dark hair with a faded ribbon, and tendrils escaped to frame her face. She looked up as his shadow fell across her work. The tomato seedlings are taking well, she said, brushing soil from her hands. We should have a good crop by August if the weather holds. Samuel nodded, noticing her use of we rather than you. She had begun to think of the garden as partly hers, as well she should, given the hours she'd invested. You've brought it back to life, he acknowledged. Margaret tried, but she didn't have your touch with growing things. Eleanor's expression softened at the mention of his late wife. She had other gifts, I'm sure. When she played the piano, Samuel said, the words emerging unexpectedly. Taught music to the town children. The instrument's still in the parlor, though no one's touched it in years. Eleanor rose, dusting soil from her skirt, one of Margaret's old dresses altered to fit her smaller frame. I noticed it. It's a beautiful piece. Samuel found himself removing his gloves, setting them aside. Without a word, he knelt beside the garden row Eleanor had been tending and began gently pressing soil around the base of a fragile seedling. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor knelt beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as they worked in companionable silence. The moment held no words needed, none. Just the warm earth beneath their hands, the promise of growth, and the shared understanding of what it meant to nurture something from fragility to strength. When the sun slipped below the horizon, they rose together, the garden put to bed for another day. Thank you, Eleanor said simply as they walked back to the house. Samuel nodded, knowing she meant more than just the help with planting. It's good to see things growing again, he replied, his gaze taking in not just the garden, but the children waiting on the porch, the smoke rising from the chimney, the signs of life returning to his land. Then, word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads and small township of Redwater. By the second Sunday after Eleanor and her children had come to stay with Samuel, the whispers had grown from curious speculation to outright scandal. Samuel had never been one for regular church attendance, preferring to commune with his Maker in the solitude of his fields. But Eleanor had expressed a desire to take the children to services, and he found himself hitching the wagon early that morning, determined to accompany them despite his misgivings. You don't have to come, Eleanor said, as she helped Emily with the buttons of her best dress, one of Sarah's cut down and remade. I know how people will talk. Let them, Samuel replied, his voice even. I made a promise to protect your family. That includes your reputation. The church was a simple, white clapboard building with a modest steeple situated on the edge of town. As Samuel helped Eleanor and the children down from the wagon, he was acutely aware of the stares and whispers from the families already gathered on the steps. Mrs. Hollister, a pinch-faced woman whose husband owned the largest grain warehouse in the county, made a show of drawing her teenage son away as they approached. Several other women clustered together, their expressions ranging from disapproval to avid curiosity. The men were more circumspect in their judgment, offering curt nods to Samuel while eyeing Eleanor with speculative glances. Only Reverend Jenkins stepped forward to welcome them, his weathered face creasing in a genuine smile. "Mrs. Reed, children," he greeted warmly, "and Samuel, it's been some time since you graced our congregation." "Reverend," Samuel acknowledged with a slight incline of his head. "We're grateful for the welcome," Eleanor added, her chin lifted despite the weight of stares pressing upon her. The children huddled close, Timothy standing protectively near his sisters, while Michael gripped his mother's skirt. "God's house welcomes all," Jenkins replied with a pointed glance at the whispering congregants. "Please come inside. Service is about to begin." They followed him into the church, Samuel unconsciously placing himself between Eleanor and the curious onlookers. The interior was cool and dim after the bright spring sunshine, smelling of beeswax and old hymnals. Samuel guided them to a pew near the back, positioning himself at the end, as if standing guard. The service proceeded as it always had: hymns, prayers, scripture readings. Samuel found himself watching Eleanor more than listening to the sermon. She sang in a clear, sweet voice, helped Emily find the right pages in the hymnal, and maintained her dignity despite the sideways glances directed her way. Her children, too, behaved with remarkable decorum, though little Emily eventually dozed against her mother's side. When the service ended, Samuel prepared himself for a quick departure, but Eleanor surprised him by moving deliberately toward a group of women gathering for after-church socializing. He followed at a distance, close enough to intervene if needed, but giving her space to establish herself. "Mrs. Greenlee," Eleanor addressed a plump, motherly woman who had been less obvious in her scrutiny than the others. "I wanted to thank you for the quilt you sent when my Joseph passed. It's kept the children warm through many cold nights." The woman flushed with pleased surprise. "Why, Mrs. Reed, I didn't think you'd remember such a small gesture, what with all your troubles." "Kindness is never forgotten," Eleanor replied, "especially in difficult times." She turned to another woman. "Mrs. Watson, your husband's rheumatism has the willowbark tea provided any relief I've found. Adding a touch of honey makes it more palatable." Gradually, through such careful overtures, Eleanor began to thaw the ice of suspicion. Not all responded positively. Mrs. Hollister and her circle maintained their distance, noses firmly in the air. But by the time they prepared to leave, several women had engaged Eleanor in genuine conversation. As they climbed back into the wagon, Samuel gave her a questioning look. "A widow with 4 children cannot afford to be isolated," Eleanor explained quietly, "especially one in our unusual situation." Samuel nodded, understanding her strategy. She was neither apologizing for their arrangement nor allowing herself to be ostracized. It was a fine line to walk, requiring both courage and diplomacy. "You handled that well," he said as they drove away from town. Eleanor sighed, some of her careful composure slipping now that they were alone. "It's not the first time I've faced gossip. When Joseph and I first came west, people whispered because I was educated, because I used herbs instead of calling the doctor for every ailment, because I taught my daughters to read as well as my sons." Samuel glanced at her profile, struck by the quiet strength evident in her features. "People fear what they don't understand. Or what challenges their comfortable notions," Eleanor added, her gaze on the children dozing in the back of the wagon. "Either way, we'll weather it." She paused, then corrected herself. "I'll weather it. I don't mean to presume on your hospitality indefinitely." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "You and the children are welcome for as long as you need." The words felt insufficient, but they were all he could offer in that moment. Eleanor's eyes met his briefly. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything." The use of his given name still felt intimate, a small trust offered and accepted. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, the spring prairie stretching endless around them, scattered with wildflowers turning their faces to the sun. The letter from Judge Wilson arrived a week later, carried by a travel-worn courier who accepted Samuel's offer of coffee before continuing his rounds. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling slightly as she broke the seal. Samuel stood by the window, giving her privacy while remaining present if needed. The children were outside Timothy helping with the horses, the others playing under the old cottonwood tree. He's reviewed the deed in Joseph's will, Eleanor said, finally looking up from the densely written pages. The property legally belongs to me and the children. The Reed cousins have no claim. Relief softened her features momentarily before concern returned. But he says the formal hearing won't be for another month. The circuit court only comes through Redwater every 6 weeks. Samuel nodded, unsurprised. Justice moves slowly on the frontier. A month? Eleanor's voice trailed off. I can't impose on you for so long. It's no imposition, Samuel replied automatically, the phrase having become familiar between them. Eleanor set the letter down carefully. Samuel, people are already talking. Another month will cement the scandal in their minds. He moved to sit across from her at the table, his large frame making the chair seem smaller than it was. Mrs. Reed, Eleanor, what exactly are you concerned about, the gossip itself or the effect it might have on your family's standing? She considered the question seriously. Both, I suppose. The children will eventually return to that community. I don't want them marked by scandal. And you, she hesitated. Your reputation matters as well. You've built something admirable here. Samuel's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held an unexpected warmth. My reputation can withstand a few wagging tongues. As for the children, they'll be judged by their character in the long run, not by the circumstances that brought them here. Eleanor studied him, seeing beyond the stoic exterior to the deep well of honor that guided his actions. You truly believe that? I do. Samuel rose, moving back to the window where he could see the children playing. They're good children, Eleanor. Resilient. They'll thrive despite this temporary difficulty. Eleanor followed his gaze, watching as Timothy showed his younger siblings how to fashion whistles from reeds gathered by the creek. Their laughter carried across the yard, lighter and more frequent with each passing day. They're happier here than they've been since Joseph died, she admitted softly. Safer, well-fed. She joined Samuel at the window. Sometimes I feel guilty for that happiness, knowing it comes at the cost of your privacy and reputation. Samuel turned to her, his expression serious. Don't. There's been too little happiness in this house for too long. Their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement of shared grief, of unexpected connection, of possibilities neither was ready to name. The moment was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Samuel's posture changed instantly, one hand moving to the rifle always kept ready by the door. Stay inside, he said tersely. Call the children in. Eleanor hurried to the door, signaling Timothy to bring the younger ones. Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready as he scanned the horizon. A single rider approached from the east, not from the direction of town, but from the open prairie. As the figure drew closer, Samuel's stance relaxed slightly, though he kept the rifle in hand. Pawnee, he said when Eleanor joined him on the porch, the children safely inside. One of Looking Horse's sons, I think. Eleanor's hands twisted in her apron. Are they hostile? I've heard stories. Not Looking Horse's people, Samuel interrupted. We have an understanding. I helped his youngest daughter through a difficult childbirth 2 winters ago when a blizzard kept the Indian agent from reaching them. Eleanor looked at him in surprise. You delivered a baby. A rare flush touched Samuel's weathered cheeks. Not exactly. I remembered what Joseph taught us in the field about keeping wounds clean about fever. It was enough to keep mother and child alive until help arrived. The rider drew close enough to reveal a young Pawnee man of perhaps 20, his hair in 2 long braids, his clothing a mix of traditional dress and items clearly traded from white settlers. He raised a hand in greeting as he approached. Swift Hawk, Samuel called, setting his rifle aside in a gesture of trust. It's been many moons. The young man dismounted with fluid grace. Hayes, he replied, his English accented but clear. My father sends word. Samuel gestured toward the house. Come inside. Share our meal. Swift Hawk hesitated, his dark eyes taking in Eleanor's presence with surprise. You have taken a wife? A guest, Samuel corrected. Mrs. Reed and her children are staying with me while legal matters are settled. The young man nodded, accepting this explanation without further question. My father would speak with you. There is trouble coming. Samuel's expression grew serious. What kind of trouble? Swift Hawk glanced at Eleanor, clearly weighing what could be said in her presence. Samuel noticed his hesitation. Mrs. Reed can be trusted, he said firmly. Her husband was a friend to all people like myself. The young Pawnee seemed to accept this, though his posture remained wary. White men have been raiding our hunting grounds, taking horses. 2 nights ago, they burned a storage cache with winter provisions. Samuel's jaw tightened. Army, Swifthawk shook his head. Not soldiers. These men hide their faces. But they speak of clearing the land for proper settlement. Eleanor's breath caught. Vigilantes? Perhaps, Samuel's voice was grim, or opportunists using fear of Indian attacks to drive off both settlers and Pawnee, then claim the land for themselves. Swifthawk watched this exchange with interest. My father says these men came from the direction of town. They knew where our cache was hidden. His implication was clear. Someone local was involved. Samuel nodded slowly. I understand. Tell Looking Horse I'll come to his camp tomorrow. We'll talk more then. The young man seemed satisfied with this response. He declined the offer of food but accepted a packet of coffee beans and some tobacco that Samuel fetched from inside. With a final nod to Eleanor, he mounted his horse and rode away, becoming a diminishing speck against the vast prairie. You speak their language, Eleanor observed as they watched him go. Samuel shrugged slightly. Enough to get by. It seemed wise to understand my neighbors. Eleanor studied his profile, adding this new piece to her understanding of the complex man beside her. These raiders, could they be a danger to the homestead? Possibly. Samuel's voice was measured, neither dismissing her concern nor heightening it. More likely they're focused on driving the Pawnee further west to open their hunting grounds for cattle. But if Looking Horse thought it important to warn you, Samuel turned to her, his expression grave. The Pawnee and I have an alliance of sorts. That makes me a potential target, yes. He paused. If you and the children would feel safer in town. No. Eleanor's response was immediate and firm. We're safer here with you than anywhere else. The certainty in her voice seemed to surprise them both. After a moment, Samuel nodded. Then we'll take precautions. Timothy's old enough to learn to shoot, and I'll show you how to use the shotgun if needed. Eleanor swallowed hard but nodded. I've fired a gun before. Joseph taught me when we first came west. A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. Of course he did. Joseph was always practical about such things. The mention of her late husband hung between them both connection and barrier. Eleanor looked away, first turning toward the house where the children waited. I should explain to them what's happening, she said, without frightening them unnecessarily. Samuel touched her arm briefly, a rare physical contact that sent warmth through her despite the circumstances. You're good at that. Finding the balance between truth and comfort. The compliment, simple as it was, brought color to Eleanor's cheeks. A mother's job, she murmured, but the words felt inadequate for the complex emotions stirring within her. Shima. That night, a spring storm rolled across the prairie, bringing sheeting rain and spectacular displays of lightning. The children, initially frightened by the thunder that shook the house's timbers, gradually calmed as Eleanor taught them to count the seconds between flash and boom to judge the storm's distance. It's moving away now, she assured them, as a particularly bright flash illuminated the parlor where they had gathered. See, almost 10 seconds before the thunder. Samuel watched from the doorway, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. The scene before him was so domestic, so filled with simple warmth, that it made his chest ache with a feeling he couldn't name. Eleanor sat in Margaret's old rocking chair, Emily curled in her lap, while the other children sprawled on the rug around her feet. The lamplight cast a golden glow over them, creating a pocket of safety against the wild night beyond the windows. Tell us a story, Mama, Sarah pleaded, her 9-year-old face alight with anticipation. Eleanor smiled, stroking Emily's hair. What kind of story would you like? One about Papa, Timothy said quietly from his place by the hearth. About the war. A shadow crossed Eleanor's face, but she nodded. Very well. Did I ever tell you about the time your father saved an entire field hospital during the Battle of Gettysburg? Samuel stilled his coffee, forgotten. He had never heard the full story from Joseph's perspective, had been unconscious for much of it, and afterward the chaos of war had separated them before Joseph could be properly recognized for his heroism. It was July 1863. Eleanor began, her voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller. Your father was a medic with the 83rd Pennsylvania under Sergeant Hayes' command. At the mention of his name, the children's eyes flickered to Samuel, still standing in the doorway. After a moment's hesitation, he moved into the room, settling into a chair slightly apart from the family circle, but still within its warm radius. Eleanor continued weaving the tale of how Joseph Reed, a farm boy turned medic, had stayed behind when Confederate artillery targeted a Union field hospital. How he had organized the evacuation of the wounded, carrying those who couldn't walk to safety, returning again and again into the burning building. On his last trip in, she said, her eyes meeting Samuel's, briefly, he found a sergeant who had been overlooked in the chaos. The man was unconscious, a bullet in his leg. Your father knew he couldn't leave him behind, even though the flames were spreading rapidly. The children were spellbound, even Timothy, who had heard versions of this story before. Samuel found himself equally captivated, hearing for the first time how Joseph had described those harrowing moments. The sergeant was a large man, much heavier than your father, Eleanor continued. But Joseph managed to drag him to safety just before the roof collapsed. He tended the man's wounds himself, staying by his side through the night, even as the battle raged around them. Was the sergeant grateful? Michael asked, his 7-year-old face serious. Eleanor's gaze returned to Samuel, something unreadable in her eyes. Very grateful. He told Joseph that a debt like that could never be repaid, that he would remember it all his days. Samuel's throat tightened. The simple words could not convey the profound impact of that night, how he had woken to Joseph's boyish face smudged with soot and blood, how the young medic had somehow kept infection at bay with limited supplies, how Samuel had later recommended him for a commendation that was lost in the bureaucracy of war. What happened then? Sarah prompted when the silence stretched. Eleanor drew a breath. Then your father returned to his unit. He and the sergeant served together until the war's end. They became friends, bonded by what they had experienced. She smoothed Emily's hair, her voice softening. Before they parted ways, the sergeant promised your father that if anything ever happened to him, he would look after his family. The weight of that promise filled the room, settling around Samuel's shoulders like a physical thing. He met Eleanor's gaze across the space between them, seeing in her eyes not accusation, but understanding, perhaps even gratitude. And he kept his promise, Timothy said quietly, looking at Samuel with new respect. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. He did. The moment stretched electric with unspoken emotion. Then Emily yawned, hugely breaking the tension, and Eleanor rose, announcing bedtime for all. The children protested half-heartedly, but the excitement of the storm had tired them, and they went without much resistance after bidding Samuel a shy goodnight. Left alone in the parlor, Samuel moved to the window, watching the lightning illuminate the distant horizon. The storm was moving east, leaving behind the fresh, washed smell of rain and renewal. He remained there until he heard Eleanor's step on the stairs returning from settling the children. Thank you, he said without turning, for telling the story that way. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. It was Joseph's story to tell, and yours. I never knew he wrote to you about it. He wrote about many things, about his sergeant who led from the front, who never asked his men to take risks he wouldn't take himself. Her voice was soft in the dimly lit room. About how much he respected you. Samuel turned to her, his weathered face vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. I should have been the one who died that day, not Joseph. Not later at Cold Harbor. Eleanor shook her head gently. Joseph wouldn't have seen it that way. He believed everyone's life had purpose. What purpose is there in survival when better men die? The question emerged rough-edged, as if torn from some deep place within him. Eleanor's hand rose, hesitated, then settled lightly on his arm. Perhaps to keep promises, to honor their memory by living well. Her fingers were warmed through the fabric of his shirt. To build cradles even when there's no child to fill them, because creation is an act of faith in the future. Samuel looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face, finding no pity there, only understanding born of shared grief. Something shifted between them in that moment, some barrier giving way to possibility. The sound of Emily crying out in her sleep broke the spell. Eleanor withdrew her hand, taking a step back. I should go to her. The storm frightens her. Samuel nodded, gathering himself. Of course! Good night, Eleanor. Good night, Samuel. She moved toward the stairs, then paused, looking back at him, framed against the window. Joseph would be proud of how you've kept your word. I want you to know that. After she had gone, Samuel remained by the window for a long time, watching the last flickers of lightning fade into darkness, feeling the echo of her touch on his arm, the weight of her words in his heart. The next morning dawned clear and rain-washed, the prairie gleaming like a new minted coin in the early light. Samuel rose before sunrise as always, but found Eleanor already in the kitchen, preparing a packet of food for his journey to the Pawnee camp. "You should eat before you go," she said, handing him a cup of coffee. "It's a long ride." Samuel accepted the cup, struck by the easy domesticity that had developed between them in such a short time. "I won't be gone more than a day, 2 at most." Eleanor nodded, her hands busy with bread and dried meat. "I've included some of my willow bark tea for Looking Horse's wife. Timothy mentioned her joint pains when Swifthawk visited last month." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You've been discussing medicine with my Pawnee visitors." A faint blush touched Eleanor's cheeks. "Not directly, but Timothy is observant, and he knows I'm interested in such things." She hesitated. "I hope that's all right. I don't want to overstep." "It's more than all right," Samuel assured her. "Looking Horse's people respect healing knowledge regardless of its source." He sipped his coffee, watching her efficient movements. "You'd be welcome to accompany me someday. Their women are skilled with plants even I don't recognize." The offer clearly surprised and pleased her. "I'd like that," she said simply. They ate breakfast together in companionable silence as dawn brightened outside the windows. When Samuel finally rose to leave, Eleanor handed him the food packet in a small leather pouch. "Tobacco for Looking Horse," she explained, "and some dried cornflowers for his daughter, who had the difficult birth. They make a tea that strengthens the blood." Samuel accepted, both strangely touched by her thoughtfulness. "You've prepared well. Hospitality matters even among different peoples." She walked with him to the door. "Be careful, Samuel. Those raiders—" "I'll be watchful," he promised. "Timothy knows what to do if there's trouble. The shotgun is loaded, and Sheriff Parker will check on you today or tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, her expression resolute despite the worry in her eyes. "We'll be fine. Just come back safely." Something in her voice and the intensity of her gaze stirred a warmth in Samuel's chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. "I will," he said, the words carrying the weight of another promise. As he mounted his horse and rode toward the eastern horizon, Samuel glanced back once to see Eleanor standing on the porch, her hand raised in farewell, the rising sun illuminating her figure against the white clapboard of the house. The image stayed with him as he rode across the awakening prairie, the woman silhouetted against his home, waiting for his return. The Pawnee camp was situated in a sheltered valley about 15 miles northeast of Samuel's property, near a year-round stream that provided both water and protection. As Samuel approached, he could see the conical skin lodges arranged in a rough circle, smoke rising from cooking fires despite the spring warmth. Children were the first to spot him, calling out in high voices as they ran to alert the adults. By the time Samuel dismounted at the edge of the camp, Looking Horse was waiting to greet him, dressed in a mixture of traditional Pawnee clothing and items acquired through trade, a calico shirt beneath a beaded vest, leggings, and moccasins. "Hayes," the older man said, extending his hand in the white man's greeting he had adopted for certain visitors. "You come quickly. This is good." Samuel clasped the offered hand. "Your son's message seemed urgent." Looking Horse nodded, his weathered face grave beneath gray-streaked hair. "Walk with me. There are things better shown than told." They moved through the camp, drawing curious glances from women working outside the lodges and elders sitting in the shade. Samuel noted signs of preparation, weapons being repaired, belongings packed in readiness for quick movement. The atmosphere held a tension he hadn't felt in his previous visits. At the far side of the camp, Looking Horse led him to where several horses were penned. One, a paint gelding, bore a vivid wound across its flank, a deliberate cut that could only have been made by a knife or similar weapon. "3 nights ago," Looking Horse explained, his English deliberate but clear, "they took 6 horses, left this one wounded as a message." Samuel crouched to examine the injury, which someone had cleaned and packed with a poultice of herbs. "What kind of message?" "That next time it will be people, not horses." Looking Horse's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held banked anger. "They left this also." He handed Samuel a scrap of paper crumpled and stained. Written in crude block letters were the words, "Red man go or red man die." Samuel's jaw tightened as he read. "Have you shown this to the Indian agent?" Looking Horse made a dismissive gesture. Agent Webster cares for papers, not justice. He says we provoke them by hunting too close to white settlements. That's your treaty, right? Samuel pointed out. Treaties are words on paper to men like Webster. Looking Horse gazed across the camp to where his people went about their daily tasks. My grandfather signed the first treaty with white chiefs when I was a boy. Each new paper gives us less land, less freedom. Samuel couldn't argue with this assessment. He had seen enough broken promises in his lifetime to understand the Pawnee leader's cynicism. These raiders, he said instead, how many? 5, perhaps 6. They come at night, faces blackened. But one, Looking Horse paused. One rides a horse with a white blaze and one white sock. I have seen this horse in town. Whose? Samuel asked sharply. Looking Horse shrugged. I do not know names, but I would know the horse. This was potentially valuable information, though not enough to take to Sheriff Parker without further evidence. Samuel mentally cataloged the horses he'd seen around Redwater, trying to recall one matching that description. My people are afraid, Hayes, Looking Horse continued. Some want to fight. Others say we should move west again. His weathered face showed the weight of leadership. I say we have moved enough. Samuel nodded slowly. I understand. What can I do? Be our eyes in town. Listen for those who speak against us with too much knowledge of our ways. Looking Horse's gaze was shrewd. And perhaps speak to your friend the sheriff. He is a fair man for a white. Parker's fair, Samuel agreed, but he needs evidence, not suspicions. Then we will find evidence. Looking Horse gestured toward a group of young men, including Swifthawk, who were preparing weapons nearby. My hunters are tracking the raiders. If they return, we will be ready. The implications were clear. If the Pawnee caught the raiders in the act, blood would be shed, and regardless of provocation, white authorities would likely side against the Indians. Give me time, Samuel urged. Let me speak to Parker, see what I can learn in town. Looking Horse studied him, measuring his sincerity. 3 days, he said finally. Then my young men will protect what is ours as they must. It wasn't much time, but Samuel knew it was the best compromise he would get. 3 days, he agreed. They sealed the agreement by sharing a pipe, the smoke rising between them in the ancient ritual of trust. Afterward, Looking Horse invited him to share the evening meal, an invitation Samuel accepted, knowing it would be taken as a sign of respect. As they ate, Samuel presented Eleanor's gifts, the tobacco and cornflowers. Looking Horse's wife, Singing Bird, was particularly pleased with the latter, recognizing their medicinal value immediately. Your new woman knows plants, she said in her limited English, her dark eyes appraising. She is why I won. Samuel felt his neck warm slightly. Mrs. Reed is not my woman. She's the widow of a friend staying with me temporarily. Singing Bird exchanged a glance with her husband, a look that seemed to contain amusement. She makes medicines for our people, sends gifts, lives in your lodge, cares if you return safely. She shrugged. In Pawnee, thinking already your woman. Samuel opened his mouth to correct this assumption further, then closed it, realizing the futility of explaining the complexities of white social conventions regarding widows' property and reputation. Instead, he simply nodded respectfully and accepted another serving of stew. Later, as he prepared to sleep in the lodge provided for his use, Samuel found himself thinking of Eleanor, of her hand on his arm in the storm-lit parlor, of her figure outlined against his house in the morning light, of the way she had said, "Be careful," as though his safe return mattered deeply to her. Perhaps Singing Bird's assessment wasn't so far off the mark after all, at least, in terms of the connection growing between them. The thought should have alarmed him. It was too soon after her loss, too complicated, given their circumstances. Instead, he found it settling into his consciousness with surprising rightness, like a key turning in a long-rusted lock. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with dreams of prairie fires and desperate choices of Joseph Reed's face as he dragged Samuel from the burning hospital, of Eleanor standing in a garden of green shoots calling him home. Eleanor woke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching the house. For a moment, she thought Samuel had returned early from the Pawnee camp. But the rhythm was wrong, too many horses moving too quickly. She slipped from bed, pulling a shawl around her nightdress as she moved to the window. The first gray light of dawn revealed several riders approaching from the direction of town, at least 5 men, their intent unclear but their haste concerning. Moving swiftly, Eleanor woke Timothy first. Riders coming, she said, keeping her voice calm. Wake your brother and help me with the girls. Quickly now. Timothy's eyes widened, but he nodded immediately, alert. Eleanor hurried to the other bedroom where Sarah, Michael, and Emily slept, rousing them with gentle urgency. "We need to be very quiet," she told them. "Some men are coming to visit, and we must be ready." Sarah, perceptive as always, caught the tension beneath her mother's calm demeanor. "Is it the Reed cousins?" she whispered. "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted, "but we'll be careful regardless." She helped the younger children dress hurriedly, then moved downstairs to the kitchen, where Samuel had shown her the loaded shotgun kept inside a cupboard. Her hands trembled slightly as she removed it, checking that it was ready as he had taught her. Timothy appeared at her side, his young face set in determined lines. "I'll protect us, Ma." Eleanor touched his cheek briefly. "We'll protect each other, but let me speak to them first. Stay with your siblings in the pantry until I call for you." The boy hesitated, clearly wanting to argue, but nodded and herded the younger children into the walk-in pantry as instructed. Eleanor positioned herself by the front window, shotgun held ready, but out of immediate sight, and waited. The riders drew up in the yard, their horses blowing from hard riding. In the strengthening dawn light, Eleanor recognized William Reed at once, his florid face twisted with triumph. Beside him was George, and with them 3 men she didn't know, rough-looking characters with the hard eyes of men accustomed to violence. William dismounted first, striding toward the house with confident purpose. "Mrs. Reed," he called loudly, "we know you're in there. Come out and spare yourself embarrassment." Eleanor's heart pounded, but she kept her breathing steady as she opened the door, remaining on the threshold with the shotgun now visible in her hands. "Mr. Reed," she acknowledged coolly, "you're out riding early." William faltered momentarily at the sight of the weapon, then recovered his bluster. "Put that down, Eleanor. You'll hurt yourself." "I know how to use it," she replied evenly. "State your business and then leave. Mr. Hayes isn't here, as I suspect you already knew." George dismounted to join his brother. "That's precisely why we've come, cousin, to spare you further scandal while Hayes is away consorting with savages." His tone made the word an obscenity. Eleanor's grip tightened on the shotgun. "The only scandal here is how you've treated your dead brother's family. Judge Wilson has already confirmed that the property is legally mine and the children's." "Legal technicalities," William dismissed with a wave. "We've come to take you back where you belong under proper family supervision." "I belong where I choose to be," Eleanor stated firmly, "and I choose to remain here with my children." One of the unknown men spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "Told you she'd be difficult," he drawled to William. "Women get notions of independence when they're not properly managed." Eleanor raised the shotgun slightly, centering it on William's chest. "I suggest you and your friends leave now, Mr. Reed." William's face darkened. "You can't stay here alone, woman. The community won't stand for it. It's indecent, a widow living in a single man's home without chaperone or family supervision." "My decency is not your concern," Eleanor replied, though she felt the weight of his words. The community's judgment could indeed make life difficult for her and the children, regardless of legal rights. George took a step forward, his voice taking on a wheedling quality. "Be reasonable, Eleanor. Think of the children. What kind of example are you setting for Sarah living here with Hayes? The girl's reputation will be ruined before she's old enough to understand what it means." This barb struck closer to home. Eleanor had indeed worried about the effect of gossip on her children, especially as they grew older. But the alternative, returning to the Reed cousins' dubious protection, was unthinkable. "My children are well cared for here," she said firmly, "better than they ever were under your protection." "Hayes won't be back for days," William said, his tone hardening. "We know he's gone to the Pawnee camp. Plenty of time for accidents to happen out here all alone." The threat was unmistakable. Eleanor steadied the shotgun. "I won't tell you again to leave." William looked to his companions, a silent signal passing between them. The 3 unknown men spread out slightly, flanking the house. Eleanor realized with growing alarm that they had planned this confrontation carefully, waiting until Samuel was away, bringing enough men to overwhelm her resistance. "You can't shoot us all, Eleanor," George said almost gently. "Be sensible. Come with us peacefully, bring the children, and no one needs to get hurt." Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't hold off 5 men indefinitely, especially not while protecting 4 children. But something in their manner, the careful timing, the hired toughs, suggested this was about more than family propriety or community standards. "This isn't about scandal at all, is it?" she said suddenly. "You're afraid of what Judge Wilson will find when he examines the accounts." You've been stealing from the estate systematically, and you need me under your control before the hearing." A flicker of surprise crossed William's face before he masked it. "Don't be ridiculous. We've managed Joseph's property as our own blood demanded." "You've stripped it bare," Eleanor countered. "Sold the livestock, neglected the fields, pocketed the profits. Even Joseph's personal possessions, his father's watch, his books, all gone to line your pockets." "You have no proof of that." George snapped, his pretense of concern evaporating. "Perhaps not yet," Eleanor acknowledged, "but Judge Wilson is a thorough man. He'll find the discrepancies." William's expression hardened into something ugly. "Enough talk. Boys, get the woman and children. We're leaving." The three men started forward, and Eleanor's finger tightened on the trigger. Before she could fire, however, the sound of approaching horses froze everyone in place. Around the bend in the road came Sheriff Parker, accompanied by two deputies. Behind them rode Samuel Hayes, his expression thunderous as he took in the scene before him. The tableau held for a breathless moment Eleanor on the porch with the shotgun, the Reed brothers, and their hired men caught in the act of advancing the newcomers, arriving like avenging angels. Then William Reed found his voice. "Sheriff, thank goodness you're here. Mrs. Reed has gone hysterical, threatening us with that shotgun when we came to check on her welfare." Parker dismounted slowly, his weathered face impassive. "That right, Mrs. Reed? You feeling hysterical this morning?" Eleanor's relief at their arrival was tempered by caution. "No, Sheriff. I'm feeling quite clear-headed about defending my home and children from intruders who threatened that accidents might happen while Mr. Hayes was away." Samuel had dismounted and now moved to stand beside Eleanor on the porch, his presence solid and reassuring. "I'd be interested to hear why you thought my absence was an opportunity, Reed," he said, his voice deceptively quiet. William flushed. "We were concerned for Mrs. Reed's reputation left alone in your house, unchaperoned. The community has standards, Hayes." "The community," Beatty, Samuel replied evenly, "seems more concerned with justice than gossip these days." He turned to Parker. "Sheriff, I cut my visit to Looking Horse short when I encountered your deputies on the trail. They mentioned the Reed brothers had been gathering some unsavory characters at the saloon, making plans that involved my property." Parker nodded, his gaze sharp on the three unknown men. "Got word from Tom at the livery that these gentlemen were asking particular questions about your schedule, Hayes. When they rode out at first light, seemed prudent to follow." One of the hired men began edging toward his horse, but Parker's deputy leveled a rifle at him. "Stay put, mister. We're having a conversation." William's bluster was fading rapidly. "This is outrageous. We have every right to be concerned about our brother's widow." "Funny way of showing concern," Samuel observed, "bringing armed men to a house with children." Eleanor felt Timothy's presence behind her and realized the children had emerged from the pantry, drawn by the voices. She passed the shotgun to Samuel and gathered Emily into her arms, keeping the other children close. "Sheriff," she said clearly, "I want these men off this property. They've threatened me and frightened my children." Parker studied the scene thoughtfully, then nodded. "Reed, you and your brother and these friends of yours are going to ride back to town with me and my deputies. We'll have a long talk about trespassing, intimidation, and a few other matters that have come to my attention." "What matters?" George demanded, a note of panic entering his voice. Parker's smile was cold. "Judge Wilson arrived last night. Seems he found some interesting discrepancies in the estate accounts you have been managing. Wanted to ask you about them personally." The blood drained from William's face. "We've done nothing wrong," he insisted, but the protest sounded hollow even to Eleanor's ears. "Then you've nothing to worry about," Parker replied. "Mount up, gentlemen. We're going to town." Under the watchful eyes of the deputies, the Reed brothers and their companions returned to their horses. As they prepared to depart, William turned back, his face twisted with malice. "This isn't over, Hayes," he spat. "You'll regret interfering in Reed family business." Samuel's expression didn't change, but his hand settled briefly on Eleanor's shoulder, a silent promise of protection that spoke more eloquently than words. They watched until the group disappeared down the road, the tension slowly draining from the air. Only then did Samuel turn to Eleanor, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right, the children?" Eleanor nodded, still holding Emily close. "We're unharmed, just shaken." She met his gaze steadily. "You came back early." "Fortunate timing," Samuel acknowledged, though something in his expression suggested it had been more than luck. "Very fortunate," Eleanor agreed softly. They stood together on the porch, the morning sun warming the prairie around them. The danger past, but not forgotten. Eleanor felt the solid presence of Samuel beside her, the weight of her children's trust, and knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. In that moment, with dawn breaking golden across the land, Eleanor Reed allowed herself to acknowledge what her heart had been telling her for days, that in this house with this man, she had found not just shelter, but the possibility of a new beginning, a second chance at happiness that neither of them had expected to find. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it settled into her soul with the rightness of coming home after a long journey. The day after the confrontation with the Reed brothers dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect late spring morning that seemed to belie the tensions simmering beneath the surface of their lives. Eleanor rose early, finding Samuel already at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling before him, his expression distant. "You didn't sleep," she observed, moving to the stove to start breakfast. Samuel glanced up, momentarily surprised by her perception. "No," he admitted. "Too much to consider." Eleanor nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. The threat posed by the Reed brothers had shifted from petty harassment to something more dangerous. And beneath that concern lay the growing connection between them, unspoken, but increasingly undeniable. "Sheriff Parker will hold them for a day or two at most," Samuel continued, "and Looking Horse's people face raids that may be connected to men in town. You think the Reeds are involved with the attacks on the Pawnee?" Eleanor measured coffee into the pot with steady hands. Samuel considered this. "Perhaps not directly, but men like that create an atmosphere where others feel emboldened to take what isn't theirs." He watched her efficient movements around the kitchen, a space that had somehow become hers in the short time she'd been there. "The judge's arrival complicates matters. For the better, surely." Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. "If he's found discrepancies in the accounts, that strengthens our position." "It does," Samuel agreed, "but it also makes William and George more desperate. Men backed into corners rarely act rationally." Eleanor set the coffee pot on the stove and came to sit across from him, her face solemn in the early light. "What do you suggest?" "I need to return to Looking Horse's camp today," Samuel said after a moment. "I promised to bring him Parker's response about the raids, and there may be information his hunters have gathered about the raiders. And the children and I," Eleanor's voice was steady, practical, "I'd prefer you all come with me to town, stay at the hotel until things are settled." Samuel met her eyes directly. "The Reed brothers have shown they are willing to use force. I don't want you alone here." Eleanor's chin lifted slightly, that small gesture of determination he had come to recognize and admire. "This is our home now, however temporary the arrangement. I won't be driven from it by threats." The word "our" hung between them, significant and unchallenged. Samuel studied her, recognizing the strength that had carried her through the loss of her husband, the struggles with the Reed family, the difficult journey to this moment. "Then I'll ask Deputy Lewis to stay here while I'm gone," he decided. "Parker can spare him for a day." Eleanor nodded, accepting this compromise. "How long will you be at the Pawnee camp?" "Back by nightfall," Samuel promised. 2 days at most if Looking Horse has information that needs investigation." Their eyes held for a moment, the connection between them almost tangible in the quiet kitchen. Then footsteps on the stairs announced the children's awakening, and the spell was broken. Eleanor rose to continue breakfast preparations while Samuel finished his coffee, their movements around each other comfortable, now synchronized in a way that spoke of growing familiarity. Timothy was the first to appear, his hair tousled from sleep, but his eyes alert. "Are they coming back?" he asked without preamble, his young face serious. Samuel regarded the boy with respect. "Not today. Sheriff Parker has them in custody for questioning." He gestured for Timothy to sit. "But I'll need your help while I'm gone. Deputy Lewis will stay here, but you're the man of your family." Timothy straightened, accepting the responsibility with grave dignity. "Yes, sir. I'll watch over Ma and the little ones." Samuel nodded, seeing Joseph Reed's steadfastness in his son. "I know you will." The other children filtered in, still sleepy-eyed but brightening at the smell of bacon and biscuits. Eleanor moved among them with quiet efficiency, settling Emily in her chair with a cushion to boost her height, helping Michael with a stubborn button, answering Sarah's questions about the day ahead. Samuel watched this morning ritual with a curious ache in his chest. The house, so long empty of all but his solitary presence, now hummed with life. The thought of returning to silence when their temporary arrangement ended seemed suddenly unbearable. As if sensing his thoughts, Eleanor glanced up, catching his gaze across the busy kitchen. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement perhaps of how completely their lives had intertwined in such a short time. Samuel looked away, first rising to check his rifle and prepare for the day's journey. But the moment stayed with him, a warmth in his chest that felt dangerously like hope. Deputy Lewis arrived mid-morning, a young but capable man with a steady gaze and a no-nonsense manner. Samuel briefed him on the situation while Eleanor packed food for his journey to the Pawnee camp. "Parker says to tell you the judge is holding a formal hearing tomorrow," Lewis informed them. "Wants both you and Mrs. Reed there to testify against the Reed brothers." Samuel nodded, absorbing this information. "And the men they brought with them, drifters from over Nebraska way," Lewis said with distaste. "Got quite a story once Parker started asking questions. Seems the Reeds hired them to help convince Mrs. Reed to return to their protection. One of them mentioned something about burning out unwanted neighbors too." Eleanor, who had entered with Samuel's food packet, stilled at this. "Burning?" Lewis glanced at her, then back to Samuel. "Yes, ma'am. Sheriff thinks they might be connected to those raids on the Pawnee camp. Looking into it now." "All the more reason to speak with Looking Horse today," Samuel said grimly. He accepted the food from Eleanor with a nod of thanks. "Lewis will stay until I return. Keep the house secured after dark." "We will," Eleanor promised. She hesitated, then added, "Be careful, Samuel. The Reed brothers might have friends watching the trails." The concern in her voice warmed him, even as it highlighted the danger. "I'll take the creek route, less exposed." Samuel prepared to leave, checking his weapons and supplies with methodical care. As he mounted his horse, Timothy approached, his young face solemn. "Mr. Hayes," the boy said, his voice pitched low to avoid being overheard, "I found something you should know about." He glanced toward the house where Eleanor was giving final instructions to Deputy Lewis. "Last night when I was checking the barn, like you showed me, I saw a man watching the house from the ridge." Samuel's attention sharpened. "What kind of man?" "Couldn't see clearly," Timothy admitted. "But he had a rifle and he was watching through some kind of glass like those field glasses officers used in your war stories." "You're sure about this?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice calm despite the alarm rising within him. Timothy nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. I didn't tell Ma because she was already worried, but I thought you should know." Samuel placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, impressed by his composure. "You did right, Timothy. Tell Deputy Lewis if you see anything like that again immediately. Understand?" "Yes, sir." The boy hesitated, then added with determination, "I'll protect them while you're gone, I promise." Samuel looked into the eyes of Joseph Reed's son and saw the same unwavering loyalty that had led his father to pull a wounded sergeant from a burning building. "I know you will, son," he said softly. "You're your father's boy." The words brought a straightening to Timothy's shoulders, a pride that transformed his young face. Samuel squeezed his shoulder once more, then turned his horse toward the eastern trail, his mind already calculating the implications of a watcher on the ridge. Eleanor stood on the porch as he rode away, one hand raised in farewell. Samuel committed the image to memory, Eleanor, with the morning sun in her hair. The children gathered around her, his house, a backdrop to the family tableau. Whatever came next, he would remember this moment. The journey to Looking Horse's camp took longer than usual. Samuel chose a circuitous route, following creek beds and keeping to low ground where possible, alert for any sign of watchers. Timothy's report had unsettled him more than he cared to admit, suggesting a level of organization and planning beyond what he'd expected from the Reed brothers. The Pawnee camp was unusually quiet when he arrived in the early afternoon. Children who would normally run to greet him remained close to their mothers, and the young men stood guard at the perimeter, weapons ready. Looking Horse emerged from his lodge as Samuel dismounted, his face grave. "Hayes," he greeted, "you return quickly. This is good." Samuel clasped the offered hand. "The situation in town has developed. The men who may be raiding your camps have shown their hand." Inside Looking Horse's lodge, they sat cross-legged by the central fire pit, sharing a pipe as custom dictated before serious discussion. Looking Horse's wife, Singing Bird, brought them tea but did not join the conversation, her worried eyes speaking volumes as she withdrew. "My hunters found tracks," Looking Horse said when the ritual was complete. 6 horses 2 days ago moving toward your lands from the north. They did not approach our camp, but circled like wolves testing a herd." Samuel absorbed this information, connecting it to Timothy's sighting. One of them was watching my house last night. The Reed brothers, the men who threatened Mrs. Reed, were arrested, but they have allies. Looking Horse nodded, unsurprised. The sickness of greed spreads easily among men. The sheriff believes these men may be connected to the raids on your camp, Samuel continued. One of them spoke of burning out unwanted neighbors. The Pawnee leader's face darkened. Burning is the white man's way. Destroy what cannot be possessed. He studied Samuel for a moment. These men threaten your woman and the children. Samuel didn't bother correcting the assumption this time. Yes, they came while I was here yesterday. Fortunately, the sheriff arrived in time. And now you ride alone, leaving them protected only by one deputy. Looking Horse's tone was not accusatory, merely observational. I needed to warn you, Samuel explained, and to ask for your help. This clearly surprised the older man. My help? How can Pawnee help when white law does not listen to our words? Not testimony, Samuel clarified. Information. Your hunters know the land better than any white man. If they've tracked these raiders, they may know where they camp, how many there are. Looking Horse considered this request. My young men have followed their signs. 6 men, as I said. They camp in the old trapper's cabin near Snake Creek. They have many guns. The location was significant, remote enough for privacy, but positioned between the Pawnee hunting grounds and Samuel's homestead. A strategic choice for men planning raids on both. There's a hearing in town tomorrow, Samuel said. The judge will decide the legal fate of the Reed brothers and their claims on Mrs. Reed's property. I believe these men planned something before that can happen. Looking Horse's dark eyes were shrewd. They will burn your home while you are gone. Make it look like Pawnee raid. The assessment aligned with Samuel's own fears. Yes, that would serve both purposes, drive out Mrs. Reed and turn the town against your people. What do you ask of me, Hayes? Looking Horse asked directly. Samuel met his gaze steadily. Keep your hunters watching the raiders' camp. If they move toward my homestead, send a rider to warn the deputy. And if necessary, we protect the woman and children. Looking Horse finished. This I can do. For the wife of the man who saved you and for the alliance between us. Relief coursed through Samuel. Having Pawnee eyes on the raiders significantly improved their chances of preventing an attack. Thank you, my friend. Looking Horse made a dismissive gesture. No thanks needed between allies. His expression softened slightly. Now tell me of this woman who has brought life back to your eyes. The request caught Samuel off guard. He was not a man accustomed to discussing personal matters, but the Pawnee chief had been his friend for years, one of the few people with whom he'd shared the story of Margaret's death. Eleanor Reed is remarkable, Samuel said finally. Strong, intelligent, devoted to her children. She was a respected healer in her community before hardship forced her to focus solely on survival. Looking Horse nodded approvingly. A woman of medicine. This explains the good herbs she sent for Singing Bird's pains. Joseph, her husband, who died, was a medic in the war, Samuel continued. He taught her much, but she had knowledge of her own as well. And your heart turns toward her. Looking Horse observed with the directness of his people. This is good. Too long you have walked alone with ghosts. Samuel didn't deny it. Out here with this man who understood loss and duty pretense seemed pointless. It's complicated. Looking Horse made a sound that might have been amusement. Life is complicated. Hearts are simple. He leaned forward, his weathered face serious. The dead honor us not by our grief, but by our living fully. Your wife who died, would she want you alone forever? The question struck deep. Samuel had never fully considered what Margaret would have wanted for him after her death, too consumed by his own grief and guilt to look beyond it. No, he said finally, the truth of it settling in his chest. Margaret would want me to live, to find happiness if I could. Looking Horse nodded, satisfied. Then honor her by doing so. He rose, signaling an end to their conversation. Go now. Return to your woman and the children. My hunters will watch the raiders and send word if they move. Outside, as Samuel prepared to depart, Swift Hawk approached with 3 other young Pawnee warriors. We will ride part way with you, he announced. Make sure the trail is clear. Samuel understood this was not a request, but a courtesy being extended. He nodded his thanks, touched by the gesture of protection. As they mounted and rode west, the afternoon sun at their backs, Samuel felt a curious lightening of his spirit despite the dangers ahead. Looking Horse's words had penetrated a barrier he'd maintained for 3 years, the unexamined assumption that loyalty to Margaret's memory required perpetual solitude. The possibility of another chance at happiness, of a future with Eleanor and her children, no longer seemed like a betrayal, but like the natural course of life continuing its flow. With this realization came renewed urgency. He needed to return home to ensure Eleanor's safety, to face whatever threat the raiders posed. And beyond that immediate concern, he needed to find the words to express what was growing in his heart before it was too late. Eleanor watched from the parlor window as dusk gathered across the prairie. Samuel had promised to return by nightfall, but the western horizon remained empty of riders. Beside her, Deputy Lewis shifted uneasily, clearly sharing her concern, though trying not to show it. "He's likely taking a careful route back," the young man offered. "Hayes knows what he's doing, ma'am." Eleanor nodded, appreciating the attempt at reassurance. "Yes, he does." She drew the curtain closed as the last light faded. "Children, time to prepare for bed." Timothy looked up from the checkerboard where he'd been playing with Michael. "But Mr. Hayes isn't back yet." "He may be delayed," Eleanor said carefully. "We'll follow our normal routine." The boy's eyes showed understanding beyond his years. "Yes, Ma." As the children washed and changed for bed, Eleanor moved through the house with Deputy Lewis checking windows and doors. The young deputy had proven attentive and capable throughout the day, but she sensed his growing unease as night fell with no sign of Samuel. "I've stoked the stove," Eleanor told him as they returned to the kitchen. "There's coffee and stew keeping warm if you get hungry during your watch." Lewis nodded, his boyish face serious in the lamplight. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll keep a sharp eye out." Eleanor hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her. "Deputy, do you believe the Reed brothers were working alone?" The young man considered his answer carefully. "No, ma'am, I don't. Men like that usually have connections, people who benefit from their schemes or share their views." He glanced toward the darkened windows. "Sheriff Parker is looking into who might have helped them acquire those hired guns." This confirmed Eleanor's own suspicions. "And he left only you to guard us." Lewis straightened, perhaps hearing criticism in her question. "Sheriff has limited deputies, ma'am, and with the judge in town's security there is priority." He checked his revolver with practiced hands. "But I'm a fair shot, and Hayes taught me a thing or two about watchfulness." Eleanor softened, recognizing the young man's sincere commitment. "I'm sure he did, and we're grateful for your presence." After settling the children in their beds, Eleanor returned downstairs to find Lewis positioned by the front window, his rifle across his knees. The house felt different in Samuel's absence, less secure despite the deputy's presence, as if missing its foundation. "You should try to rest, ma'am," Lewis suggested. "I'll keep watch, and Hayes may yet return tonight." Eleanor knew she wouldn't sleep until Samuel was safely back, but she nodded and retreated to the parlor, leaving the deputy to his vigil. There she picked up her mending one of Samuel's shirts that had torn at the shoulder and tried to focus on the simple, repetitive motion of needle through fabric. Her mind, however, returned repeatedly to the man himself, to the quiet strength that had become her family's shelter, to the growing understanding between them that needed no words, to the possibility of a future she had never expected to find after Joseph's death. The thought no longer brought guilt as it once might have. Joseph had been gone over a year now, and in his final letters he had written of his respect and admiration for Samuel Hayes. "If anything happens to me," he had written, "there is no man I would trust more with your welfare and that of our children." As if those words had granted permission, Eleanor found herself contemplating what it might mean to remain here permanently, not as a guest dependent on Samuel's protection, but as a partner in building something new from the foundations of their separate losses. The sound of hoofbeats startled her from these thoughts. She rose quickly, the mending falling forgotten to the floor as she moved toward the front of the house. Lewis was already at the door, rifle ready, peering into the darkness. "One rider," he reported tensely. "Coming fast." Eleanor's heart leapt with hope and fear. "Samuel." Lewis shook his head. "Can't tell yet." He positioned himself to use the doorframe as cover. "Stay back, ma'am." The rider thundered into the yard, pulling his horse to a sudden halt. In the spill of lamplight from the window, Eleanor recognized not Samuel, but a young Pawnee warrior, his face painted for battle. "Swift Hawk," she breathed, remembering the young man who had visited previously. Lewis hesitated, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unexpected arrival. Eleanor moved forward decisively. "Let him approach," she said. "He's a friend of Mr. Hayes." The deputy reluctantly lowered his rifle as Swift Hawk dismounted and strode toward the house, his manner urgent but not threatening. Mrs. Reed, he called, using her name with careful precision. Hayes sends warning. Men come from Snake Creek. 6 riders with guns. My hunters watch them. Eleanor's blood chilled. Where is Mr. Hayes? Follows behind, told me right ahead, warn you. Swift Hawk's dark eyes were intense in the lamplight. Men will come before dawn. Plan to burn house. Lewis cursed under his breath. We need to get you and the children to town, ma'am, right away. Eleanor shook her head firmly. No, this is our home. We will defend it. She turned to Swift Hawk. How far behind you is Mr. Hayes? 1 hour, maybe less, the young warrior replied. More Pawnee come too. Looking Horse sends warriors to help. This news steadied her resolve. Then we prepare. Deputy, help me wake the children. Swift Hawk, are you willing to stay and fight with us? The young man's chest expanded with pride at being consulted as an equal. I stay. My brothers come soon. We fight together. Lewis looked between them, clearly struggling with the protocol of the situation. Ma'am, my duty is to get you to safety. And we will be safest here with Mr. Hayes and the Pawnee warriors coming to our aid, Eleanor replied with quiet authority. If we flee now, we may encounter these raiders on the open road with no shelter or defense. The deputy couldn't argue with this logic. Very well, but I'll need to position you and the children somewhere defensible if trouble comes before Hayes arrives. Eleanor nodded, her mind already cataloging the house's defensive possibilities. The root cellar, it has a heavy door and stone walls. She turned to Swift Hawk. Thank you for the warning. Please tell your people we are grateful for their help. The young warrior nodded solemnly. Hayes saved my sister's child. We not forget. He gestured toward the darkness beyond the yard. I go now, watch road. Return when raiders come. As Swift Hawk melted into the night, Eleanor and Lewis moved with urgent purpose, waking the children and explaining the situation in terms calculated not to terrify, but to impress the seriousness of their circumstances. Timothy immediately volunteered to help defend the house, his young face set in determined lines. I can shoot, Mr. Lewis. Mr. Hayes has been teaching me. The deputy assessed the boy thoughtfully. Your job is to protect your mother and siblings in the cellar, son. That's where you're needed most. Eleanor gathered essential supplies, water blankets, a lamp, Samuel's spare revolver, and led the children to the root cellar accessed through the kitchen pantry. The space was cool and dry with shelves of preserved food lining the walls and a sturdy door that could be barred from inside. We'll stay here until Mr. Hayes returns, she explained, settling Emily on her lap as the other children huddled close. Deputy Lewis will let us know when it's safe. Sarah, ever perceptive, studied her mother's face in the lamplight. The bad men are coming to hurt us, aren't they, Mama? Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair, searching for words that would comfort without false promises. Some men are coming who want to frighten us away from our home, but Mr. Hayes and his friends won't let that happen. Because he promised Papa he'd take care of us, Michael said, with the simple faith of a 7-year-old. Yes, Eleanor agreed softly, because he promised. But in her heart, she knew it was more than a promise to Joseph that drove Samuel now. The connection that had grown between them transcended obligation, becoming something neither had sought, but both now cherished. Upstairs, she could hear Lewis moving furniture to create barricades at the windows. The wait for Samuel's return stretched interminably, each minute passing with excruciating slowness as Eleanor maintained a calm facade for her children, while her heart raced with fear and hope. Samuel pushed his horse hard, knowing the animal's limits, but conscious of every passing minute. Swift Hawk had ridden ahead with the warning, but the raiders had a significant head start from their camp at Snake Creek. The night was clear, a half moon providing enough light to follow the trail without unnecessary risk. Behind him rode 3 Pawnee warriors, silent and capable, their presence a reassurance he hadn't expected to need, but now welcomed. As they crested a rise that offered a view of his homestead in the distance, Samuel felt rather than saw the shift in the night's energy. His companions sensed it too, drawing their horses to a halt beside him. Riders, one of the Pawnee said softly, pointing to movement on the far side of Samuel's property. 6, maybe 7. Samuel's jaw tightened as he counted the distant figures approaching his home from the northwest, the opposite direction from their current position. The raiders had timed their approach carefully, likely believing the house defended only by Deputy Lewis and a woman with children. They'll surround the house, he said grimly. We need to circle behind them, approach from the east where they won't expect us. The Pawnee warriors nodded, understanding the strategy immediately. They descended the ridge and cut across a low drainage using the land's contours to mask their approach. Samuel's mind raced ahead, calculating angles of fire points of vulnerability, the precious minutes they needed to close the distance. As they drew nearer, Samuel could make out figures taking positions around his house. The raiders had split into two groups, 3 men approaching the front, 3 circling to the rear. Their movements suggested military experience, a coordinated attack rather than random violence. A flash of gunfire erupted from the house, Lewis firing a warning shot from an upstairs window. The raiders scattered briefly, then regrouped with greater determination. Samuel saw one man gesture toward the barn, another toward the house itself. Their intent was clear: burn the structures, force the occupants into the open. We need to move now, Samuel told his companions, before they start the fires. The Pawnee needed no further encouragement. They spurred their horses forward, emerging from the shadows like avenging spirits. Samuel rode slightly ahead, his Winchester raised voice carrying across the night-shrouded yard. That's far enough, he called, his tone carrying the unmistakable authority of a man who had commanded in battle. Drop your weapons. The raiders froze momentarily, clearly shocked by this unexpected arrival. Then one man taller than the others with a distinctive hat visible in the moonlight shouted an order, and the night erupted in gunfire. Samuel fired twice in rapid succession, saw one raider fall, then drove his horse toward the shelter of the barn as bullets whined around him. The Pawnee warriors scattered to separate positions, their movements coordinated without need for verbal communication. From the house, Lewis provided covering fire, his aim precise despite the chaotic situation. Samuel caught a glimpse of movement at an upstairs window. Eleanor, he realized with a surge of both pride and fear, armed with the shotgun and defending her children. The firefight intensified, bullets splintering wood and shattering glass. Samuel worked his way methodically around the barn's perimeter, using its bulk for cover as he picked off another raider who had been attempting to set fire to the structure. Swifthawk appeared suddenly at his side, face-painted for war, a rifle in his hands. More Pawnee come, he reported tersely. From north, soon. Samuel nodded acknowledgement, his focus narrowing to the immediate threat, the tall man in the distinctive hat who seemed to be directing the others. Something about his silhouette nagged at Samuel's memory, a recognition he couldn't quite place in the heat of battle. The man had taken cover behind the water trough, pinned down by Lewis's fire from above, but still issuing commands to his remaining men. Samuel worked his way closer, using shadows and outbuildings for concealment, determined to end the threat decisively. A sudden cry from the direction of the house froze his blood. Eleanor's voice sharp with alarm. Samuel risked exposure to glance toward the sound and saw flames licking up the back wall of the kitchen. One of the raiders had managed to set fire to the house while the defenders were focused on the frontal attack. The house, he shouted to Swifthawk. Fire! The young warrior immediately changed direction, sprinting toward the growing flames with no regard for his own safety. Samuel turned back to the water trough, knowing he needed to neutralize the leader before he could help with the fire. The tall man seemed to sense the net closing around him. In a desperate move, he broke from cover, firing wildly as he ran toward a horse tethered nearby. Samuel stepped into his path, rifle leveled. Stop right there, he ordered, his voice deadly calm. The man froze, then slowly raised his hands, his face now visible in the moonlight. Samuel felt a shock of recognition. Hollister, he said flatly, identifying the wealthy landowner who had expressed interest in arranging for Sarah Reed to join his household. Should have known you'd be behind this. Hollister's face twisted with contempt. Hayes, always the hero. He glanced toward the house where the fire was spreading despite Swifthawk's efforts to contain it. Shame about the house. And the woman and her brats. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger, rage surging through him at the casual threat to Eleanor and the children. Only years of military discipline kept him from firing. On your knees, he ordered instead. Hands behind your head. Hollister sneered but complied, knowing himself outmaneuvered. You think this ends anything? The Reed woman is finished in this community. No decent family will associate with her after living under your roof unchaperoned. I wouldn't concern yourself with Mrs. Reed's reputation, Samuel replied coldly. You'll have enough to worry about explaining why you led an armed attack on a homestead with children inside. From the north came the sound of approaching riders, the Pawnee reinforcements Swift Hawk had promised. Hollister's face paled as he recognized the war cries. "You've allied with savages," he spat. "The town will never stand for it." Samuel bound the man's hands with his own belt, unmoved by his protests. "The town will stand for Justice Hollister. Something you seem to have forgotten." Leaving the bound man under the guard of one of the Pawnee warriors, Samuel ran toward the house where the fire had taken hold along the back wall. Swift Hawk and Lewis had formed a bucket brigade from the well, but the flames were spreading faster than they could douse them. "Eleanor," Samuel called, scanning the windows for any sign of her. "Here." Her voice came from around the side of the house, where she was shepherding the children to safety. All four were with her soot-streaked but unharmed Emily clutched in her arms, while the older three huddled close. Samuel's relief was so profound it nearly buckled his knees. He crossed to them in 3 long strides, placing himself between them and the burning house, one hand reaching instinctively to touch Eleanor's face, assuring himself of her solidity. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, eyes searching her for any sign of injury. Eleanor shook her head, her face pale but composed. "We're all right. The fire started near the kitchen, but Deputy Lewis got us out through the front door." Her eyes moved to the bound figure of Hollister. "Is it over?" "Yes," Samuel assured her, his hand dropping reluctantly from her cheek. "The raiders are either dead captured or fled, and reinforcements have arrived." He nodded toward the Pawnee warriors now surrounding the property, securing the perimeter against any remaining threat. Timothy stepped forward, his young face streaked with soot, but his eyes clear. "The house, Mr. Hayes. Can we save it?" Samuel turned to assess the fire, which had now engulfed the kitchen and was spreading to the adjoining rooms. "We'll try, son." For the next hour, every able body fought the fire, Samuel, Lewis, the Pawnee warriors, even Timothy and Sarah helping to carry buckets. Eleanor kept the younger children safely away from the flames, but organized the water brigade with calm efficiency. Despite their efforts by dawn, it was clear that the main house was lost. They had managed to save the barn and outbuildings, but the structure that had been Samuel's home for the past decade was reduced to smoldering timbers and ash. As the sun rose over the devastated homestead, Samuel stood with Eleanor and the children, watching the last wisps of smoke rise into the morning sky. His face was blackened with soot, his clothes singed, but his expression remained steadfast. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly, standing close beside him. "You're home." Samuel looked down at her, then at the children gathered around them, Timothy trying to be brave. Sarah with silent tears tracking through the soot on her cheeks, Michael wide-eyed with shock. Emily half asleep in her mother's arms. His home indeed, but not in the way Eleanor meant. "Buildings can be rebuilt," he said simply. "What matters is that you and the children are safe." Eleanor's eyes searched his face, finding truth in his words despite the magnitude of the loss. "Yes," she agreed softly. "That's what matters." Deputy Lewis approached his young face, grave beneath streaks of soot. "Sheriff Parker and the judge are on their way, Mr. Hayes. Sent a rider at first light when we saw the smoke." Samuel nodded acknowledgement. "And Hollister?" "Secure in the barn with the 2 survivors from his gang," Lewis reported. "The Pawnee are guarding them." He hesitated, then added, "Sir, what Looking Horse's people did tonight, coming to our aid, fighting alongside us, that's going to cause talk in town." "Let it," Samuel replied firmly. "Without them, we might all be dead. The truth of that matters more than any gossip." Lewis nodded, accepting this assessment. "Yes, sir." He glanced toward the east where dust on the horizon indicated approaching riders. "That'll be the sheriff now." As Parker and his men arrived, accompanied by Judge Wilson, the scene took on a more formal air. Statements were taken, evidence gathered, prisoners secured for transport back to town. The judge, a stern-faced man with penetrating eyes, surveyed the destruction with evident concern. "This goes beyond property disputes," he observed to Samuel. "Attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, serious charges. And connected to the attacks on the Pawnee," Samuel added, gesturing toward Looking Horse, who had arrived with the last group of warriors. "The same men were raiding their camps, burning food stores, stealing horses." Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose as he took in the Pawnee leader's dignified presence. "Is that so? I'd be interested to hear Chief Looking Horse's account if he's willing to provide testimony." The significance of this request wasn't lost on anyone present. Indian testimony was rarely sought or valued in white courts. Looking Horse regarded the judge thoughtfully before nodding his agreement. "I will speak truth," he said simply. "For justice, not just for my people, but for Hayes and the women and children who could have died this night. As the morning progressed, the full extent of the conspiracy began to emerge. Hollister, it seemed, had partnered with the Reed brothers in a scheme to acquire both the Reed homestead and pressure the Pawnee off their hunting grounds, opening a vast tract of land for cattle grazing. The attempted intimidation of Eleanor and the raids on the Pawnee camp were part of a calculated plan to drive out both obstacles to their ambitions. Greed, Sheriff Parker said disgustedly as he prepared to transport the prisoners to town. Plain and simple. Samuel, watching Eleanor comfort her exhausted children in the shade of the barn, felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The house that had been both home and prison, the place where he had mourned Margaret, where he had lived half a life, was gone. In its place stood possibility undefined but real. Judge Wilson approached him as the sheriff's party prepared to depart. "Hayes, I've heard enough today to render an immediate judgment on the Reed property dispute. The deed clearly belongs to Mrs. Reed and her children without question." He paused, his shrewd eyes taking in Samuel's protective stance near Eleanor. "But she'll need a safe place for her family now, with winter coming and a new house to build." "They'll stay with me," Samuel said without hesitation. "We'll rebuild right here." The judge nodded, a knowing gleam in his eye. "I thought you might say that." He lowered his voice slightly. "There might be fewer questions if your arrangement had the sanction of law and church." Samuel understood the suggestion immediately. "I'm aware of that, Your Honor." "Good man." Wilson clapped him on the shoulder. "The hearing tomorrow is just a formality now. No need for Mrs. Reed to attend if she's occupied with more pressing matters." With that, he moved away to join the departing party. Left alone, Samuel turned toward the barn, where Eleanor had finally succumbed to exhaustion, dozing with her children in the clean hay of an empty stall. He watched them for a moment, this family that had arrived in his life unexpectedly and transformed it completely. The unfinished cradle, he realized with a pang, had been lost in the fire. The symbol of his inability to move forward, to complete what had been started, reduced to ash, along with the house that had contained too many ghosts. Yet as he watched Eleanor stir her eyes opening to find him immediately, Samuel felt no regret for that loss. The cradle had served its purpose, a bridge between grief and healing, between past and future. Now it was time to build something new. 2 days later, with the Reed brothers and Hollister securely jailed awaiting trial, Samuel and Eleanor stood amid the cleared foundation of the burned house. The children were helping Looking Horse's people set up a temporary shelter nearby, a gift from the Pawnee chief who had declared the Hayes family under his protection. "The town's been surprisingly supportive," Eleanor observed, watching as a wagon from Redwater arrived with lumber and supplies donated by neighbors. "Even Mrs. Watson, who was so cold to me at church." Samuel nodded, pleased but not entirely surprised. People respect courage and recognize injustice when it's laid plain before them. He gestured toward Timothy, who was earnestly helping to unload the wagon. "Your children have shown remarkable resilience." "They've had a remarkable example," Eleanor replied softly, her eyes meeting his. Samuel took a deep breath, finding himself uncharacteristically nervous. "Eleanor, there's something I need to ask you." She turned to face him fully, her expression open, yet somehow knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "The house will be rebuilt before winter." Samuel began, the words emerging with careful deliberation. "Larger than before, with room for all of us. But as the judge pointed out, there might be fewer questions about our arrangement if it had proper sanction." A smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Are you proposing Samuel Hayes?" Samuel felt a flush rise in his weathered cheeks. "Not very skillfully, it seems." He took her hands in his expression growing serious. "I made a promise to Joseph to protect his family. I've tried to honor that promise as best I could. But what I feel for you, for the children, goes beyond obligation now." Eleanor's hands tightened on his, encouraging him to continue. "I love you," Samuel said simply, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. "I never expected to say that to anyone after Margaret died. Never thought I'd find room in my heart for a new family. But you and the children have become more precious to me than I can express." Tears gathered in Eleanor's eyes, but her smile remained steady. "And we love you, Samuel. The children speak of little else but helping you rebuild, making our home together." She emphasized the word "our" deliberately. "As for me, I've found in you a partner I never dared hope for after losing Joseph. Samuel drew her closer, his voice dropping to ensure privacy in the busy yard. Then will you marry me, Eleanor Reed? Make this new house a true home, raise our children together, face whatever comes side by side. Yes, she answered without hesitation. With all my heart, yes. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, sealing the promise between them. When they separated, Samuel rested his forehead against hers for a moment, overcome by the simple perfection of this new beginning. A small voice interrupted their private moment. Mama, Mr. Hayes. Emily stood nearby, her 4-year-old face solemn with some important purpose. I found something. Eleanor smiled, keeping one hand in Samuel's as she turned to her youngest. What did you find, sweetheart? Emily held out her cupped hands. In them lay a small, partially charred wooden piece. The curved headboard of the unfinished cradle somehow survived amid the ashes of the house. It's pretty, the little girl said, offering it to Samuel. Was it for a baby? Samuel knelt to accept the fragment, emotion tightening his throat as he recognized the piece he had shaped with such care over long, lonely nights. Yes, he said finally, it was for a baby who never came. Emily considered this with childish gravity. Could it be for a new baby instead? Mama says new things grow from ashes. Samuel looked up at Eleanor, whose face showed surprise, and something else, a soft wonder, a private knowledge not yet shared. His questioning gaze met hers, and the slight nod she gave him confirmed what Emily's innocent question had somehow intuited. Yes. Samuel said, his voice rough with emotion as he gathered the child into a one-armed embrace. I believe it could be for a new baby. A very special one. Emily beamed, pleased with this answer. Good, because I want a little sister. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free in the afternoon sunshine. We'll see what we can do about that, but it might be a brother instead. As Emily skipped away to share this important news with her siblings, Samuel rose to face Eleanor, the cradle fragment still in his hand. Is it true? He asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, her eyes shining. I suspected just before the fire, but wasn't certain until yesterday. I was waiting for the right moment to tell you. Her hand rested briefly on her still flat stomach. A new life. A new beginning. Samuel's hand covered hers, his heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. The best kind of beginning. Together they turned to watch the activity around them, the children helping to raise the temporary shelter, the townspeople unloading supplies, the Pawnee warriors who had become allies and friends moving easily among them. Out of violence and loss had come this unexpected harmony, this chance to build something truly meaningful. I made a vow to Joseph, Samuel said softly, to protect his family. Now I make one to you under this western sky, to love you and our children, those here and those to come, for all the days we're granted together. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, her presence solid and real beside him. And I vow to walk beside you, Samuel Hayes, through whatever joys and sorrows lie ahead. To make a home not just of timber and nails, but of love and memory and hope. As the sun began its descent toward the prairie horizon, painting the scene in gold and amber, Samuel Hayes held close the woman who had brought him back to life, the fragment of an unfinished cradle, now a promise rather than a regret in his hand. The house that had sheltered his grief was gone, but in its place would rise a true home, built on the foundation of promises kept and new ones just beginning. Across the yard, the children's laughter rose like prairie birds taking flight, and Samuel knew with bone-deep certainty that this moment, these people, this love, was what he had been waiting for all along. Not an ending to a story, but its true beginning. The end.